Good morning. This is the BLAINESWORLD podcast that can be found each week on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. You can also listen in on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or you can find us elsewhere wherever you find podcasts listed. And you get more information on previous shows at our website, which is www.blainesworld.net. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and I'm here in my Zoom studio in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. Each week, we focus on positive news and information about people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce you to a friend of mine who has some really exciting news. And she is Rebekkah Hilgraves. I just saw this. We have a middle name there. Vox is another name.
Vox is, yeah. So that's my kind of code name with the studio. All the principal engineers with the studio, we all have Ox nicknames.
Okay, cool. So I now know another name for Rebekkah Hilgraves, but she has a degree and 30 years of study as a classical singer with side trips onto jazz, rock, and blues. What's interesting about that, Rebekkah? So you started at the age of what, 3? Was that it?
Bless your heart.
Yeah.
No, I actually started, well, I started singing basically the day I was born, but started taking lessons when I was a teenager and started, my first stage experiences were with my father because he was a touring musician. And so, yeah, I've been kind of doing it my whole life. So I suppose the 3 is
not too far
in that sense, yeah.
And we'll talk about that. She's been a broadcaster and broadcast engineer for over 35 years, starting back
almost
when
40 now.
Starting when radio stations were excited to get their signals over a couple of countries. With a strong technology and marketing background, in addition to all the broadcasting and specializing in voiceover and classical and jazz recordings, she has a particular passion for making artists look and sound both intimate and excellent. I have to give you a compliment, Rebekkah. You certainly do that. And I've seen, your work is just so amazing. But what I asked you to come on board tonight to talk a little bit about is the new studio you're starting. But even before we talk about the new studio, let's go back to your early background. She said you started as a singer with your dad. And did you ever tour with him?
No, I would get to meet him. I was too young, but I would get to meet him at some of his locations. And then, he would let me sit in with him for a couple of tunes, starting when I was probably, 14 or 15, something like that. Do
you remember your first gig? They got paid for it.
Actually, yes, I do. And it was Danny's song, and I messed up the words because I didn't know. Let's see. The word there was a reference in there to a fraternity, a sorority, Beta Chi, and I pronounced it Chi because I didn't know any better. So that I remember bitterly and clearly to this day.
Now, here we have a fundraising idea for you, or when we get the studio off the ground, and that is, do you have a record of that first performance? Did they do a videotape of that?
No.
Okay. But I always have that as an idea. Wouldn't that be cool that everybody would recreate their first songs they ever did? So even though you didn't have it when you were that age, to be able to reproduce it now, that'd just be a fun thing to do. So
that could be fun, yeah.
Or everybody come to your studio, and by the way, keep that in the back of your mind. It'd be a fun way to kick things off the ground, that to announce your studio, everybody gets a chance to do their very first song. Just
that would be a great deal of fun. Really
or commercial or something like that. Just thought of as we're speaking. But Rebekkah, then I got to know you, I guess, first, and we had on a show a couple of years ago when I had a radio show. You were at the time with RadHaus Black Mountain. And talk a little bit about what you did there, because it just knocked my socks off what you did, and it was just so amazing.
Thank you. And it was a terrific growing experience too. So what we did was, when the pandemic started, I had already done some work with Whitehorse. There was an electronic music festival there, actually a year before I moved here. And I happened to be in the area, and I got to broadcast it for the radio station that I was working for at the time. And I kind of fell in love with Whitehorse. It felt like home at the end of the weekend. And Bob was great, and Don Talley was there. Now, of course, he's come back, and they were terrific. They were great hosts. The venue was beautiful, so it was a lot of fun. And during that festival, I met the man who is now my partner, and I had to go to the coast of North Carolina to help care for my mother in her final months. And then when she crossed the Rainbow Bridge, I was looking around and thinking, I don't really want to go back to Los Angeles. And my partner was like, hey, Asheville's a great place. So moved up here. All of that is the lead up to what happened with Whitehorse. Shortly after I moved up here, about a year and some months after, the pandemic hit. And I realized that Whitehorse was probably not going to survive the pandemic on its own. So what I did was I offered to let's have artists come in with no audience. Let's set up some cameras and let's broadcast their performances anyway. So it was a kind of a living room concert sort of thing, but at the Whitehorse venue. And it sort of expanded over time. And so for a little over 2 years, we were there with video cameras and audio equipment, and we were doing, in the end, we ended up running the house sound once an audience was allowed to come back in. But then running these multi-camera shoots and doing the broadcast audio and streaming them across a number of different platforms. And we were streaming nearly all of the shows and ended up streaming, I think it was something close to 170 episodes in those years. And we learned a ton during that time. It was kind of like not a learning curve so much as a vertical climb, because I hadn't done video before other than, cheap little webcams and a laptop. But over time, I invested some money. We got some great crew. And I'll tell you right now, I couldn't do any of this without the amazing crew that I was lucky enough to assemble in the course of doing all of this. So we did these films, these videos, and broadcast them, and we were able to post them on the Whitehorse website. We teased them out on Facebook and things like that. And so, and the objective was to save Whitehorse, to make sure that it was still up and running when the pandemic was over, and also to help the artists out a little bit. Because of course, when tours dried up and shows dried up, artists were left twisting in the wind. There was no place for them to go. And they kind of fell through the cracks in terms of the federal help that was coming through for people who were suffering, because they were all technically contract employees, so they couldn't get unemployment, and they couldn't get the PPP or anything like that because they were these independent musicians. And so a lot of them really suffered during this time. So the objective was to help them out, help Whitehorse out, make sure everyone survived this as best they could. And then when the pandemic was over and the doors opened again, we continued for a little while with audience, and it went really well. And as I say, we learned so much during that time, and now have a locker of amazing microphones and amazing cameras that we collected during that time.
I want to thank you, because during that time you helped me get through the process, because again, I would love it that at least a couple times a month I would come in to see a concert. And boy, I've seen other people do concerts, but you did them as well as anybody I've ever seen them, because they really felt like the show. I was at the Whitehorse,
that was the idea.
The video, the mics. Let me ask you a crazy question. This is my bias, but I don't get out all that much at night, and my wife doesn't necessarily like going to concerts at night. Does it make sense for any venue to do both, like you did for a period of time? Were you doing the live when people started coming back to Whitehorse, but you were also making available on video, which I loved. Is there a market for that, or does that make any sense? Or maybe after the concert to do it?
Anymore, I don't think so, because honestly, there is such a glut now of online content. We were kind of at the forefront of it in terms of doing this, and at the very beginning of it, we did really well, both for Whitehorse and for the artists. Some real money came in to help support Whitehorse and the artists. There were ticket sales that we did online, but now there's so much online content and everyone's streaming that it's really hard to carve out that kind of niche and hope to make any sort of revenue with it.
Because what was so cool
That
about
said,
it.
that said, I don't think it's impossible to consider that, that maybe we would record highlights of a show or highlights of a season or something like that and make those available as reels for venues. No one's ever come to us to ask that, but it would certainly be something that we'd be interested in doing.
Or for example, I just helped a friend produced a play. It was at Dinah Wortham Black Box Theater, but we're talking about afterwards, then show it, so there's no venue for showing it, and we're talking about giving it legs and playing with it. But again, just that period of time, what was so exciting about it, Rebekkah, also, is I got to see a whole bunch of artists I would never see, and again, that's one of the beauties of Bob Hinkle and what he does at RadHaus. But he has all these people you'd never think of wanting to see. Yeah. And damn it, they were all good. They were all interesting. I never heard of and never thought I'd want to see a concert. But anyway, so thank you for that. So that's how I think I first met you at RadHaus, and you were doing those concerts. I just loved them. And so that ended. And then how'd you come up with the idea then all of a sudden in your spare time? And by the way, we should mention your spare time, very talented artist, performer. I've seen you, I think, twice now with the group is Pinkish Floyd.
Yep.
And so what's that all about?
Well, Pinkish Floyd is a Pink Floyd tribute project, as the name suggests. And what we do is we try to, as true as we can, we try to adhere to the original studio recordings of favorite tunes and sometimes a couple of deep cuts, because Pink Floyd audiences are generally very enthusiastic and also very well informed. And they know the canon really well. So we try to give them as great a live experience as we possibly can. That too, like many things, has evolved over time. We started out just playing the music, then we added some lights, and then we added some video projections, and now we're adding lasers as well. We all come out in especially the women come out in costumes of various kinds. And so we try to make it as true to the original experience as possible, but of course, for less money, we don't charge $150 a seat. Gosh, we wish we could. But we have some amazing performers. Our two lead singers, David Bradley and Jason Watson, are both tremendous musicians, amazing singers, and just great people to work with. I love working with them. They're like my brothers. And then we have lead guitarist Travis Corcoran, who is, and I mean, I don't want to swear on your podcast, but he's freaking amazing. He's so good. And then we have a drummer, David Bruce, who's a terrific drummer. He plays with a number of ensembles in the area. He had a wedding band for a while. He plays with, I want to say Blue Ridge Big Band, and a number of other gigs all the time. He's a very busy man. He's one of those lucky people that actually gets to make a living as a musician, which is great. And so, lucky, right? And then, the women, Kathleen Watson is Jason Watson's wife. She's one of the background singers. I, of course, am one of the background singers and also keyboard player. Jenny Bradley, one of the backing singers, is the wife of David Bradley, the bass player. Rob Grace is our keyboard player, and Patrick, whose name, of course, escapes me right at this immediate moment, and I'm embarrassed about that, is our saxophone player. So we have, just a terrific lineup of people who are playing these shows. We rehearse every week. We work very hard to get the music down and also to get the show nice and tight, so there's not a lot of dead air when we're on the stage. We don't want to just sort of stand around with our fingers up our noses waiting for someone to set up something. So we try to make it a very smooth experience, and each of the sets is just this beautiful arc of music and lights and lasers and video and kind of the whole immersive experience.
By the way, do you have an upcoming performance?
Patrick Landis, I'm sorry, saxophone player, Patrick Landis.
Very good.
Yes, we have a couple of performances coming up. One actually not this coming weekend, but the following weekend, September 14th at Home Place Beer in Burnsville. And then we have a couple in October. We have one at T-Birds, and then we have one at the Meadow in Highland Brewing at the end of October. That's the 27th. And by the way, you can always look on pinkishfloyd.com for all of our event listings. We have all of those there. And I want to say we have one other one, but I can't bring it immediately to mind. And then Whitehorse in December. Yes.
And just to encourage people, if they want to see a spectacular show, and I hadn't necessarily been a Pink Floyd fan, but you've never seen a show quite like this, so just an amazing show. And like you said, Pink Floyd, or Pink Floyd, the original, certainly had a lot of followers out there,
Yeah.
even to this day.
And still do. Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yes. So Pinkish Floyd. So something that you do. I mean, I can't believe how you find time to do this. I sometimes ask a guest, and I'll ask you this, Rebekkah. I don't see them on you, but are you wearing like roller skates in terms of getting back and forth to all these different places,
No, but I sleep about 2 hours a week.
I can only imagine. So, and we're just leading up to what you're doing now, quote, in your spare time. So you're performing, you're rehearsing, you're singing. Do you do other singing gigs aside from Pinkish Floyd?
At the moment, no. We're talking about. I'm working with a couple of musicians to do some collaboration. I don't know if you remember, but I had a band called Blind Phoenix also.
Okay, yeah, that's how I first met you. I think I did a show on that.
I
Yeah,
think that's right, actually. Yes,
right.
that's where we met in person finally. Blind Phoenix kind of didn't go anywhere, largely because my co-writer and I are on opposite ends of the state. He's down on the coast, and it's been really hard to get together to collaborate on new music, much less do shows together. So I'm working with some local folks to try to get some collaborations going, and it might take on a different name, but it's going to be original music, those sorts of things. So I'm talking with a couple of people now and kind of starting to work up some music.
And all the music you do you have a favorite thing in terms of performing, writing? Do you enjoy?
Well, here's a funny thing. I love performing. I love working with other people. What I find difficult is interacting with folks afterwards. Quite honestly, I am an introvert. You wouldn't believe it because
No.
I'm also not shy. Well, I'm not shy, but I struggle sometimes to interact with people in large social settings. So I was an opera singer and I ended up retiring from opera. And I didn't discover until after I retired that I was an introvert. And it explained so much why I struggled so much to interact with people after a performance. After that, I realized, oh, what a relief, right? So I love performing. I love working with musicians, working with other folks. Um, what I'm discovering though is that I really like the technical end of things and have always enjoyed that. I mean, starting back almost 40 years ago in radio, I really get a kick out of doing the kind of support side of things where there's this great artist who's making this amazing music and I get to kind of help make it come alive, but also to help document it. So that's where the sort of more of the technical stuff started coming in.
And what's cool about you, Rebekkah, or I find kind of cool and amazing, is you've also become an entrepreneur of sorts too. So here, talking about starting out as an opera singer, a single performer, to all of a sudden then you now start doing these gigs for other people. And again, the Black Horse being an example, but it kind of segues into what you're doing now, and again, your spare time. That all of a sudden you have the idea, and talk about how that evolved to open a recording studio.
Well, it kind of started with Whitehorse, and this is honestly the culmination of a 40-year dream. Even when I started in radio as a teenager, I got such a kick out of it, and I thought, I'd love to own my own recording studio. So over the years, I kind of stopped and started. I had a home studio a number of times through my life and bought some relatively inexpensive equipment and did that sort of thing. Couldn't ever quite take it anywhere. But when we did the work that we did with Whitehorse, and I finally figured out that I couldn't do it all on my own, and I had this amazing crew that I was working with, I realized that once our relationship with Whitehorse ended, because they're doing fine now. They really don't need us anymore. They have their audiences back. They're getting amazing acts, and so about a year ago we figured, it's time to part ways, and it's time for me to try to go out and do our own thing. So we packed up everything that we had in Whitehorse, and then I started looking around for other spaces. Now, during that time, we also built a mobile recording studio. So we have all of the gear that was at Whitehorse is now packed up into a van. So we have 32 channel mixing boards so we can do audio, and we have a video switcher so we can do up to 8 cameras simultaneously, either record or stream or both, depending on the internet connection and that sort of thing. So we built this van, and that was also something that was kind of a dream of mine. I wanted to be able to take this on the road, right, and support artists either in their favorite venue or on tour with them. I've done a couple of festivals now. We've done a couple of festivals. We went up to upstate New York a couple times for some electronic music festivals. We've done a couple here in town. We were for the Brass Fest, the NOLA Brass Fest in Asheville that was at Salvage Station last summer, I think. And then WTF, which is the Women to the Front Music Festival, which is the next one's coming up in September also. So being able to take all of that on the road is also an amazing thing. And this is where technology amazes me. Years ago, you wouldn't have been able to do this without a tour bus sized vehicle, right, because the equipment was so large. And now we're able to pack it into a Ford Transit van, and still accomplish most of the same things, which is just amazing to me that we can do that. So we have the mobile studio with all of these capabilities. And then when we left Whitehorse, I started looking for brick and mortar spaces because the full crew, we had such a good time working together, and we worked so well together. And I would not conceive of trying to do something like this without them. By myself, nah, there's no way I could have done this. But with this amazing stable of very, very talented women, I decided we need our own home. So I started looking around for spaces. I looked for a couple of places, and I looked down in the River Arts District originally, and it would have been kind of epic to be there because the name of the studio is RadHaus, and I actually named the studio long before I moved to Asheville, long before I knew what the River Arts District was. And so I thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have a studio down there? Unfortunately, it turned out to be a little too noisy for what we were trying to do, largely because of the train yards, which, there's really no way to mitigate that subsonic rumble, no matter how well isolated the studio is, right?
Right.
So we decided against that, as fun as it would have been. But instead, my commercial real estate agent is also a musician, and he's a tremendous guitar player. Well, he showed me this building. I'm not going to tell you just yet, but he showed me this building, and I looked around and I realized this place is perfect for what we want to do. It's about twice as much money and about twice as large as I had originally intended. But we have been able to put every single room in this building to use. And I'll describe it to you in a moment. Where we ended up is on the same campus as Highland Brewing.
Great location.
Yeah, it's a terrific location. And they've turned out to be amazing business partners. We're kind of starting to talk with them about collaborating on events that they have going on at Highland. So, we would be able to they're going to be recommending us as providers for weddings, for example, for corporate events that they have coming in, and maybe for some of the larger live shows that are coming in and playing either at the Meadow or in the tap room, where we could do the video and maybe do multi-track for them, those sorts of things. So they've turned out to be just a terrific collaborator on some of those things as well. Well, the building itself has an amazing provenance, and I didn't really know it until after I got into it and signed the lease. But this building is the site of the original Blue Ridge Motion Pictures. So, there's a great pedigree, right? And also the company B-Clip was here just before us. There was also a film school here. And B-Clip, it's a very similar operation. They do more of the commercial and industrial kind of things, but it's a media production company also. So here's this great pedigree of this building, and it shows in the way the building is laid out. There are spaces for tracking, and each of those spaces has room for its own separate control room. So we've got a large tracking room for a larger band, like, for instance, the Asheville Jazz Orchestra, whom we've worked with at Whitehorse, or maybe Asheville Choral Society, which we recorded them at UNCA a few months ago. And then there's a smaller tracking room, which is about half the size, which is also a little bit more intimate in terms of the sound. It's got a drop ceiling, it's tighter acoustically. So we're figuring in there we would have things like maybe a classical ensemble, a string trio or a wind quintet or something like that. And again, it has its own separate control room, which is great. And then and I didn't have to do anything to this except cut a window, kept one window. There's a whole isolation suite in one corner of the building also. So there's a control room, and there's one tracking room, and then there's another small tracking rooms, and then a slightly larger tracking room, which we figure we can use for drums. So we can actually have a band in there and isolate them with these rooms, but they all have windows. So everyone, of course, will be able to see and communicate with each other. And the only window we had to cut in there was the one between the control room and the isolation rooms.
By the way, how many,
Finished our first recording session there this weekend.
what's the square footage on this facility?
The whole building is about 4,600 square feet.
Yeah, well, it sounds
huge.
like I'm just
Yeah.
blown away. But also two other things, if you would. You mentioned, maybe give a shout out. You mentioned a realtor helped you find this location, or
Yes.
do you want to give a shout out to that person?
Yes, absolutely. His name is Scott Rains. He's with DPA.
Okay.
DPA. And he was just great. He showed us a couple of buildings, and I had originally called DPA about a different property, and they were really good to me. Tim, whose last name I can't remember just now. Sorry, I'm having trouble with names lately. Tim Bramley. Tim Bramley is his name. He's got a number of spaces in town, and so he showed me a few things, and some of them were good, a couple of them were great. But then he handed me over to Scott, because Scott is a musician, and he understood a little bit better what some of our needs were. And Scott showed me this space, and I was just, this is it. This is what we need. And then when I was talking with Scott and pointing out things, he's like, "Oh yeah, you're right. That would be great." So he got excited about it. In fact, he got excited enough about it where, because one of the things I haven't mentioned is that there's also a room for two separate rehearsal rooms on the other wing of the building. And he said that as soon as we're finished with this, that he and his band would be coming here to rehearse, because you probably have heard this. There are never enough rehearsal spaces in town. There's always a shortage. So one of the very first things I did was finish the rehearsal rooms. So as soon as we're able to open, as soon as we get the air conditioning in, these spaces will be, ready for folks to come in and rehearse. So working with a real estate agent who is also a musician was a tremendous help. And he was great. He helped us through a lot of stuff.
And as you're talking, the question I'm having in my mind is also, how do you pick up all this knowledge? In other words, this is like, I'm just listening to this and saying so many different areas you're into, aside from being this entrepreneur, to start this whole thing off the ground. But how do you pick up the technical expertise, or you just picked it up over the years?
Yep. I guess I have a brain, for which I'm grateful. And I had a lot of experience in technical fields. As a musician, of course, in this country, it's really hard to make a living exclusively as a musician. So, of course, I had a parallel career, and I ended up going into technology. So a lot of it is just because things that I've picked up through my work in technology over the years. And a lot of it is because I'm just so interested in how some of these things work that I wanted to learn about it. I don't have any schooling in any of the technology that we're doing, but I've got almost 40 years of field experience now, which counts for a lot. Understanding how to work with musicians, understanding where a microphone needs to go, how a drum should be mic'd, what's going to serve a singer well on stage, those sorts of things. And all of this I've learned in the field, on the job, on the fly. And I have made so many mistakes, both in dealing with people and also in recording. One of the reasons I end up calling in help with the audio crew to begin with was that I really didn't know much about live sound, and I absolutely fell on my face the first couple of times trying to get it right, and I bombed it. So I asked for help, and that was the beginning of the evolution of RadHaus Studios in the formation that it is now.
By the way, you mentioned some of the people you work with. Do you want to give a shout out to any of those folks who are involved with the RadHaus Studio?
I have a long list.
Well, the Reader's Digest version, but it's not just you, right? So RadHaus Studios are
it's
other
not
people.
Just me. Yeah. So we started with, and it's a funny thing how this evolved. I started with Claire Hoke, who is, you probably know, also a musician in town. She's an amazing songwriter, singer, guitar player. But the way I first knew her was she was an audio engineer, still is. and I met her at Whitehorse. And I just thought it was the coolest thing that there was a woman behind the board, at the audio desk. And so I got really excited about that. And when I was recording the album with Blind Phoenix, I specifically asked her to be involved in that because I wanted to work with a woman technologist, a woman audio engineer.
And by the way, just a quick compliment to you that I always enjoyed that when I'd see the show, you'd always give a shout out to all the people, Claire, I know name, and you'd always introduce them, which is kind of exciting, so it wasn't just RadHaus, but you mentioned this whole crew that we work with. That was cool.
Yeah, because it's not just me. There's no way I could have done any of this alone. It was a village. It was a small village of people. So Claire was my first contractor that I brought on, I suppose, that we collaborated together on these things. I learned so much from her. She's half my age. She could be my kid. But because she went to school for audio engineering, she knows a lot more about just how microphones work and why this kind of microphone works better than this one in this particular setting. So I learned a lot from her, and we learned a lot from each other, which is really cool. She introduced me then to my next audio engineer, Jess Fox, who was still going through school at the time. And she turned out to be a great live audio engineer. And so then we were able to separate it. Claire could run the broadcast audio and do a separate mix for the broadcasts. And Jess could do the front of house for when we had an audience again. So we had, we had these two women doing completely separate audio, which actually helped us a lot, rather than trying to get the sound just from the front of house mix, because you probably know this, the sound for broadcast is very different than the kind of mix that you want for the front of the house, for the audience to hear. So we separated them, and that worked out really well. Along the way, I also picked up a camera operator who is incredibly talented videographer. Her name is Jessica Wharton Vasquez. And we took her on because I had some stationary cameras. They were okay, they weren't great. And I thought, I really want a live camera operator to carry a camera around and get some of those really great rock and roll shots. And I know you've commented on this too, on some of the productions that we'd seen. She was able to get some of these shots that look like something that you'd seen on BBC or, the Berlin Philharmonic or Woodstock or something like that. She'd get these great kind of rock shots, or from behind the artist, through the artist into the lights, and so you get this beautiful colored silhouette, this kind of thing happening.
I'm smiling because I can almost, as you describe it, I can almost see it. And like you said, it wasn't just a static one camera operation. It felt like I was at a concert, which I just loved. Yeah.
And actually, and honestly, in many ways, better than sitting in the audience, because you can see the fingers of a guitarist up close. You can see the profile of a singer up close and see the emotion on their face, which you might not necessarily see from fairly far back in the audience. So we like to think that the best seat in the house is your own living room. And we kind of approached it that way. So so Jess brought in this kind of live, very visceral sort of experience to it, that I think kicked us to the next level entirely. And then brought in a few more people along the way. I can name them all.
I think that's the idea. But again, what I'm hearing you say, so it wasn't just a one-woman operation, but you had the whole crew, and it seems most of them are, or just about all of them are women?
Every single one is female. And that was a deliberate choice along the way. I had a less than great experience when I first started with a couple of men. And this is a whole other discussion, but male audio engineers, first of all, women only make up, I think, less than 2%.
I can imagine,
overall. It's insane. And part of the reason is that a lot of the men that we've worked with through the years are kind of jerks. They're very proprietary. They're very protective of their knowledge. They don't trust that a woman has a brain enough to do this. They hang on to the knowledge, or they're very stingy with it, those sorts of things. Or they're jerks, or they're sexist, or they're abusive, or they're, I've heard so many tales of sexual assault and that kind of thing. Nothing like that happened to me, fortunately, in this case. But what I did experience was a kind of arrogance that I found intolerable. I've been doing this for almost 40 years. Now, granted, it's in a different area of music technology, but I knew enough where I had an opinion. And while I am willing to learn new things from anyone who has more knowledge than I do on a topic, absolutely, I don't want it to be shoved down my throat, and I don't want it to be laid down like it's law. I want us to converse about it. I want to understand why we're doing something. I want to understand, if you have an opinion about something that's different from mine, help me understand why. I might change my mind. You might be entirely right, and I could be totally full of it. But in the cases of these other engineers, it was that they were telling me how it was done and not allowing for the fact that I'd been doing this for so long. And so the minute I could, I started working with other people and women in particular. And it turns out that that was a great decision. We do things differently. We operate as a team, we operate very differently. We learn from each other, we teach each other, we're cross-training each other, we're talking about, why does the camera do this thing? Why do I need it to sound like this? One of my camera operators might ask the audio engineer, why are you setting the microphone that particular way? Can we move it over here? Audio engineer might say yes or no, depending on the application. Those kinds of things. So we work together and we learn together, and we tend to collaborate and sort of nurture each other along. One of the neat knock-on effects of that is that the artist then has a very different experience. Artemis Pyle, you probably know who he is, drummer for Lynyrd Skynyrd.
Right.
He played at Whitehorse during the pandemic, and he worked with, it was Michael Filippone was the bass player.
Oh, okay, sure.
And then there was the guitar player, singer, whose name escapes me at the moment. Told you, I'm terrible with names right now. But anyway, Artemis came up to me afterward and said, I have traveled the world. I've worked global stages. I've worked huge festivals. I've worked tiny stages. I've worked everything in between. Yours is one of the best crews I have ever worked with. Really? Well, why? And I am going to quote him. So
I was going to say, yeah. Do we have that on our website, or we want it?
We will. Yeah, but I'm
wow.
going to say something. I'm going to quote him because it was very appropriate. It was very funny. And I asked him why, and he says, well, because you're not assholes. Right? So I laughed and I said, oh, that's awesome. Tell me more. Why are you getting that impression? And what he said was, he's worked with so many engineers who read him the riot act if he wants to change something, for instance, in his monitor mix. If he wants more bass drum in his monitors, in his floor speakers that he can hear, he would have audio engineers just yell at him, no, I'm not going to change the mix, it's going to mess everything up, blah, blah, blah. And they would read him the riot act. And I said, well, why would I fight you on that? If it makes you a better musician and you're holding down the rhythm for your band, why would I not give you what you need to make you a better musician? Because the effect is then the band is better, right? The music is better, and therefore the audience is happier. We are here to serve the art. We are here to serve the audience and the artist, but most of all, the art itself. And so for me to fight with an artist about what they want is kind of antithetical to that idea. Now, there have been times when someone has asked us for a particular thing in their mix or to EQ their guitar a certain way, and we would try to find out why they wanted to do that and then propose an alternative if we didn't think it was going to be a good result. But we always explained why. We wouldn't just grab them by the collar and say, no, we're doing it this way. That's not how we want to work. So, for Artemis to come to us and say something like that was really amazing to me. And to hear that this all-female team of, frankly, very, very young audio engineers was one of the audio and video engineers, was one of the finest crews he'd ever worked with. Well, my job is complete then, right?
Let me jump in, Rebekkah. We're running against the clock, but let me just mention two things if I can. One, you have one of the great advertising slogans of all time. Use RadHaus Studios. We're not assholes.
We're not assholes.
But I just love that, So you came up with a great advertising slogan. Also, before we wrap up, let me ask you two things. One, so the official opening, tentative opening, is going to be about when?
We're hoping for the end of September. We've had some challenges getting some things done. As you can imagine, in a project this large, contractors are always a challenge, particularly in a town this size. So we struggled and struggled and struggled to get our heating and air conditioning installed. That is finally going to start going in this week, 6 months after we had hoped to start. So we're shooting for the end of September. Cross your fingers.
Okay.
And of course, we'll announce a grand opening when that happens.
Okay. And if folks want to get more information about RadHaus Studios, either to have you do some work for them or find out more about you, what's the best bet?
A couple of different ways. The website is rad.haus, and that's rad.haus. And that's it, just rad.haus. If that's hard to remember, then radhaus.studio will also get you there. Or you can find us on Google. We're all over Google now, RadHaus Studios. We're on Facebook. It's Facebook, radhaus.studios on Facebook, also on Instagram. And those are kind of our only social media presence really these days.
Okay. And again, if you can let me know when you open up, because you and I are going to have another date when we actually get to see the studio. Look forward to that. Thank you.
I'll give you a video tour of the studio.
Okay, I'd love it. We'll talk about that. I have an idea we'll talk about. But thank you, Rebekkah Hilgraves, as always, for being my guest on this edition of the Blaine's World podcast. Also, my producer, Cappy Tassetti. And stay with me as we sign off here, Rebekkah. So thank you much.
Thanks.